Maybe so. Okay. Well, we've been sitting here talking about the lead-in, all the shots of people at the University of Houston is the lead-in here. So anyway, and wondering whether we recognize some of the people there or not. But we're going to be moving along here now, and we're going to be talking further about British literature in the 20th century. But before we begin that discussion that we're going to have tonight, let me give you, with me, an opportunity to ask any questions that you want to about the paper assignment or anything else with the class. Yeah.
And I apologize if this has already been established and I don't remember from the spring, but can we use a work that we have covered in class, or should we avoid that?
The problem with taking a work that we've covered in class is that we've covered it in class. Unless you've got some completely different approach to the work. And then I think you really ought to talk to me about that. But let me just say that unless it's a truly exceptional circumstance, that let's not do papers on works that we actually go over in class, because I want you to work on something new. Now you can take an author whom we've taken up in class, or some other author from the period. Like last time, we were talking about Achebe, and one of the students was talking to me before class about wanting to write his paper on one of Achebe's novels. Well, that's perfectly acceptable, because we didn't discuss a novel, we discussed something else with Achebe, which was his critique of Conrad. So, yes, by all means. That would be a very interesting topic. We're also talking, and maybe if I can use you as an example.
I'll be the guinea pig.
Okay, you're going to be the guinea pig? Okay. As we were talking about what he was going to do with Achebe's novel, I said, well, are you going to be taking this up from the point of view of this being colonial or post-colonial in its perspective on the culture that's being represented? And so after some discussion, we got down to the fact that the novel is set in Africa in the 19th century at a time, of course, when Europeans were coming in, as we know, as we've been discussing with Conrad, were coming into Africa. And you mentioned to me, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but one of the things that you had mentioned was that many of the Europeans, or maybe most of the Europeans who are represented in that novel, are missionaries. And I asked you, well, what is Achebe's attitude toward that? Or perhaps some principal characters in the novel, what is their attitude toward the coming of the European, and in this case, obviously Christian, missionaries? And you were saying, I believe, that there was some resentment toward them. Is that correct? Yeah. So I said, well, there you've got a paper. Because notice what you can do is you can take Achebe, who's an African, and who now is very much alive and living beyond the time of colonialism, British colonialism in Africa. But he's writing a novel about a time when the area was under British control and therefore was a British colony. And so what he's doing, in part at least, is exploring these kinds of relationships. I'm not saying that that's all that a novel has to be about, but that is an important perspective. And there are some very interesting novelists and poets and dramatists, for that matter, from Africa, from India, from Pakistan, from South Asia generally, and from other parts of the world as well, who have looked back on that colonial experience, either from having been in it themselves, like Conrad, though he was a European, looking at it, or from a post-colonial point of view, looking at it after those countries have emerged from their old colonial status in the British Empire or in relation to some other European country, such as France or Germany or Belgium, and so on and so on. So what I was suggesting in this particular case, and I'm just using this as a case study, what I'm suggesting in this particular case is that at the outset you would present the problem. You would define what the problem is. And then you would proceed in the novel to talk about different passages in relation to the general problem that you introduced at the beginning. And then, of course, come to your conclusion in your final paragraph or so, in which you talk about what you think Achebe has contributed to the discussion of this issue or of this problem. Right? Does that sound agreeable? Okay, good. So you've got a paper, and I look forward to it. I learn a lot from these papers, by the way. So, any other questions? Any other questions about papers? Anything else with the course? Okay, well then let's start to move on. Last time we were talking about T.S. Eliot. We looked in some detail at the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Obviously, we can't go into all of the works in that much detail because we actually went through every single line and every single word of that poem, but it's not a very long poem. So once again, I'm going to come back to the question of how you would handle a paper assignment. With a much longer work, you can't go into it line by line or paragraph by paragraph. And you'll have to do what I've done with the longer works, and that is to select out certain passages and talk about those passages as examples of the more general points that we're making. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Well, last time we were talking about Prufrock, as I said, and then I concluded the class by taking you through a few stanzas of Eliot's The Hollow Men. And the reason why I did that was I wanted to make a transition, really, to the Wasteland, because it is in the Wasteland, in the Hollow Men, that we see very clearly how Eliot thinks that the modern world is not simply a world of pretense and hypocrisy, as he certainly suggested in Prufrock, as well as a world in which people are unwilling to step out and make some kind of positive judgments of their own, and even to take risks in their lives, but would rather simply sit back rather passively and follow the fashions of the day. And that's a Prufrock. But even more devastatingly, in The Hollow Men, what Eliot does is he talks about how we of the modern world have become hollow and simply filled with straw. Why does he think so? Because he thinks that we have lost all kind of commitment. We have lost our faith. We have lost our moral compass. We have lost our way as a culture. And so what's left? Simply the shell of a culture, simply the shell of human beings. Now he's going to carry that same theme on in The Wasteland, but by the end of The Wasteland, there are at least some intimations of a way out, of the possibilities for renewal, which for Eliot are going to be not economic renewal or political renewal so much as a kind of spiritual renewal. One of the things that I also mentioned last time is that Eliot is really a cultural conservative, and by that I mean, as he said, and these are his words, he said, in politics, I am a Tory. In religion, an Anglo-Catholic. and in literature and the arts, a classicist. And what he was doing was he was marking out for himself a kind of position in which he was taking a very culturally conservative position, and from that culturally conservative position saw the modern world not as a world which was progressing in positive ways, but progressing in negative ways. That the modern world really was marked by decline. And of course, that's the kind of thing we're going to find in the Wasteland. So, let's go to the PowerPoint, please. And let's see where we are. Okay, the Wasteland. And, you know, as usual, we've got more than one date. That often is the case because something may undergo revision. And when it undergoes revision, we will have a second date. And let's look at the beginning. But before we get to the first movement of the work, the burial of the dead, let me draw your attention first to the fact that we begin with a quotation, which is out of an ancient classical writer, and as your note points out, this is a quotation from Petronius. And among other things, Petronius was very satirical in dealing with the culture of his time, just as Eliot is going to be very satirical in this work dealing with the culture of his own. And then immediately after that, we have in the epigraph, for Ezra Pound, the dedication is to Ezra Pound, Il miglior fabbro. Il miglior fabbro is Italian, and it means the better maker, the better maker. Pound was an American poet, very, very well known, right before and right after World War I. And of course, he lived for decades after that and became a very famous poet. He had gone to Europe, as many younger Americans did, as expatriates, especially after World War I. Eliot did that. Eliot was an American. He was from St. Louis originally. Went to college here. Was educated in the United States, went to college here, went to graduate school here, and then he moved to Europe, to England in particular. He hooked up with Pound over there. Others, as you know, were already over there. James Joyce had left Ireland and was living in various parts of Europe, but lived for the longest period in Paris. Hemingway had gone to Paris. Gertrude Stein and her circle were in Paris, where she is reported by Hemingway one time to have said one evening, "You are all a lost generation," which is where that famous expression comes from. Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda went to Paris because they didn't want to miss out on the action. Paris was where things were really happening in the 1920s, and that carried on for a while. Now, we know from some other writers and artists that things were happening elsewhere as well. Berlin was another hot spot at the time. But in any event, there were lots of Americans, as well as people from other countries, who were expatriates now living in one part of Europe or another. People sometimes ask me, well, is there any equivalent for that nowadays? Actually, there is. You know, Prague has become the Paris of our time, really. It's really kind of the happening place in our time. But in any event, yeah, I know, but it's true. It's true. So okay. So Eliot, having met up with Pound, shows Pound some of his poetry. Pound is very interested. Pound, among other things, was very good at promoting not only himself, but promoting other writers and helping them to get published. People especially who were out of the mainstream, who were not doing things with broad popular appeal. And that certainly applies to Eliot, and it also applied to James Joyce. And he did a great deal with the kinds of connections he had to get them published and to get them taken seriously as writers. Eliot gave him the manuscript of The Wasteland, and that survives. And now there's a facsimile edition, which is a reproduction of that manuscript as edited by Ezra Pound, and Pound cut about 2/3 of the work. It wasn't so much making changes, like changing this word or changing that word, as it was cutting, 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 cutting. So God only knows, what students would have to endure if we had the whole work, because this is a difficult enough work as it is. And people who have looked at the manuscript with Ezra Pound's editing would agree, and I actually have looked, not at the manuscript itself, but at a facsimile of the manuscript. And you can say, yes, Pound did very, very good work indeed as an editor. Okay, so that's why the work is dedicated, or at least that's one reason why the work is dedicated to Ezra Pound. Well, let's begin. The Burial of the Dead, Section 1. If we can go back to the PowerPoint, please. We're going to have glimpses of the modern world. And what are we going to see? As in Prufrock, as in the Hollow Men, tired, bored, soulless, in the sense of not really having any kind of soul or spiritual center, marked by ennui and anomie. Ennui and anomie mean pretty much the same thing, and people sometimes ask me to define these words, and if you haven't heard the French word ennui before, the best way of translating it is it's just what's your life like? How are you doing? It's just, blah, nothing, nothing interesting, nothing exciting, nothing important, just, that's what ennui is. And it's the state of mind that one gets into when there's just a sense that, it's like life isn't really worth living. Okay? A world without passion and commitment. In other words, the imagery we're going to see here is the imagery of a world of living dead. Of people who are still moving around, people still going through the motions of living their everyday lives, but they're really lifeless. The Burial of the Dead. April is the cruelest month. April is the cruelest month. Breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger See with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar keine Russen, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousin, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went in the mountains. There you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. Well, what's going on here? One thing that's going on, by the way, is that we're probably getting confused, right? This, once again, is modernist literature in the sense that I've been talking about it for the last couple of classes, in which there is a good deal of experiment and, as I've called it, experimentalism in the very form and structure of the poem itself. Notice that things don't hang together in a coherent way. When we were reading Wordsworth, I'm not saying that Wordsworth is just transparent and easy, but when we were reading Wordsworth, we could go from line to line, from sentence to sentence, from passage to passage, and we could, maybe with a little bit of concentration and effort, we could follow what Wordsworth was saying, right? The same thing was true when we were reading somebody like Tennyson. I'm not saying that Tennyson is just a snap. What I'm saying is that if you concentrate and spend a little bit of effort, it's not difficult to follow what Tennyson is doing in the poem, certainly at the level of what is it saying? What is a particular stanza saying? And the same thing has been true of much of the poetry that we've dealt with up to this point, and, by the way, also the prose. But now we're going to see writers increasingly experimenting with the very forms of writing. And one of the things that they're going to do is to experiment with different kinds of structures that deliberately move beyond what we expect. Deliberately move beyond what we expect. And so we're constantly going to be running into the unexpected. How do these things fit together? Also, notice that this poem really defines its own audience in a way, doesn't it? This is definitely not a poem for everybody, nor was it intended for everybody. Just one of the things that would be pretty obvious, I think, is in line 12, what do we have? We have a whole line in German. Well, if you don't know any German, you know, fortunately our editors have supplied you with a translation, but in the original publication, there weren't any footnotes. By the way, there was such a hue and cry, even among well-educated people, about that Eliot went back and he supplied some notes to the work. Now, his notes in general are to be taken fairly seriously. Faulkner, you may recall, the American novelist Faulkner, you may recall, mystified people so much in a novel like The Sound and the Fury, particularly the first part of that, the Benji section, that he was asked also to write a kind of preface to explain the work, and what he wrote was even more mystifying than the work itself, because what he was doing, in effect, really was playing a kind of joke on us. Okay? Or, if you wish, a joke with us. And so notice once again that these are some of the kinds of options that people in the arts, and not simply, by the way, in literature, but in the other arts as well, will be experimenting with. I've mentioned here things like music. If you go back and listen to some of the kinds of music and experiments that were being done with music in the earlier part of the 20th century, during the period of high modernism, and you'll find some very, very unusual experiments with music compared to what was done before. These things don't sound so unusual to us any longer because we've heard them so much, but they were very unusual then. The same kind of thing was true in film. The early films, you know, a lot of people were having a lot of trouble just figuring out how things were connected in a narrative way in the films. Until gradually, of course, what we learned was we learn what film scholars often call the grammar of film. the grammar of film. But some interesting experiments have been done where films were shown to people who had never seen films before. I'm talking about adults. This probably couldn't be possible any longer. But back in the 1920s and 30s, it was still possible to find some remote peoples who had never seen movies before. And they'd show the movies, and people couldn't figure out what was going on. And they even thought that they were images of mutilation of human bodies because you would just have a head without a body floating on the screen, or an arm or a hand out there on the screen without being attached to any body, and so forth. These things all had to be experimented with, and gradually a kind of grammar of film was worked out. Well, let's get back to the poetry here. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? We're going now back to the very beginning. You see, talking about the dead land and talking about what grows or does not grow in the dead land. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? By the way, he's going to draw these images together into the larger, more composite imagery of the wasteland. Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead trees give no shelter, the cricket no relief. This is an arid world. It's like a desert world. And the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning, striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. I will show you fear in a handful of dust, which is a famous line, by the way, in modern poetry. And you don't really want me to massacre the German, do you? Frisch weht der Wind, der Heimat zu, mein irisch Kind, wo weilest du? Well, maybe you do want me to. You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light, the silence. Ud leer das Meer. Okay, now, my advice with reading this kind of poetry and this kind of prose is just keep pushing ahead. Okay? Don't get stuck. Don't slow down. Don't look back. Okay? Push your way through. See what you get out of it. Then go back and say, okay, wait a minute now. I've got some sense of what this is about. What does this mean? Or where does that fit in? And so forth. Let's just push ahead here. Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyante. Okay? This is somebody who tells fortunes. This is what Eliot thinks that religion has been reduced to. By the way, he's a very conservative, traditional Christian believer. And so he means this satirically. Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyante, had a bad cold, nevertheless is known to be the wisest woman in Europe, with a wicked pack of cards. Notice the colloquialism here now. Here, said she, is your card. The drowned Phoenician sailor. This is, out of what kind of cards are these? They're tarot cards, right. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Look, here's Belladonna, the Lady of the Rocks, the Lady of Situations. Here's the man with 3 staves, and here the wheel. And here is the one-eyed merchant. And this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. I do not find the hanged man. Fear death by water. I see crowds of people walking round in a ring. Thank you. If you see dear Mrs. Equitone, tell her I bring the horoscope myself. One must be so careful these days. Now, for Eliot, and you won't see that right there, but when you put the whole poem together and look back at that passage about Madame Sosostris, what you recognize is that he's using that as an image of what triviality he thinks the richness of Western religion has descended to. And then we have a very famous passage here. Unreal city. Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. The brown fog of a winter dawn, okay, and a crowd is flowing over London Bridge. These are the commuters, by the way. So many. I had not thought death had undone so many. These are the undead, but they're actually living in one sense, though dead in a spiritual sense. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. There I saw one I knew and stopped him, saying, Stetson, you were with me in the ships at Mile. The corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Or keep the dog far hence, that's friend to man? Or with his nails he'll dig it up again? You, hypocrite, lecteur, mon senable, mon frère. Well, okay, what on earth is going on here? Well, we've got images of people going to work as zombies. These are the living dead, right? They're just going through the motions of life, doing the same things they have always done, putting one foot simply in front of the other, but with no real sense of purpose. And then, of course, the imagery, which is like something out of a nightmare, burying bodies that may sprout. You know, what on earth is that all about? Well, okay. Then we go to a game of chess. If we can go back to the PowerPoint, thank you. A game of chess. And we have 2 scenes of life in the modern wasteland. The first part of this is the bored, neurotic, affluent woman. I want to say rich woman, but she may not be rich, but she's certainly affluent. She's bored and neurotic. She doesn't have anything to do. She doesn't have any serious interests. She's just waiting for something to happen in her life. Oh, I'm so bored, right? Won't somebody or something come along to interest me or excite me? I am so bored. And notice how self-centered she is, too. And then in the second part of a game of chess, we have the degrading poverty and entrapment of Lil. Poor Lil. As discussed by her Cockney friends in their Cockney accent, which is simply a way of signifying now that we're dealing with working class people in London. Whereas the first part of this movement or section deals with somebody of the upper classes. The second part deals with somebody of the working class. And as we shall see, poor Lil is really trapped, but trapped in a very different way than the woman in the beginning. Okay, the chair she sat in like a burnished throne glowed on the marble, where the glass, held up by standards, wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out. These are the furnishings. These are the furnishings. Okay? And if you've ever seen these, and probably if you have, you would have seen them in museums, these were the kinds of furnishings that people who, if they were not wealthy, had considerable means, would furnish their houses with. And of course, wealthy people would. Doubled the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glitter of her jewels, this is the woman now, the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it. From satin cases poured in rich profusion, in vials of ivory and colored glass unstoppered, lurked her strange synthetic perfumes. Okay. She's surrounded by all of these expensive things. Unguent, powdered or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the scents in odors. Stirred by the air that freshened from the window, these ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the lacqueria, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge seawood fed with copper, burned green and orange, framed by the colored stone, in which sad light a curved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantel was displayed, these are all the furnishings of the room, okay, in a very expensive style of that time. As though a window gave upon the sylvan scene the change of Philomel by the barbarous king so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug, jug, to dirty ears. And other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, rushing the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the stair, under the firelight, under the brush. Her hair, spread out in fiery points, glowed into words that would be savagely still. Well, again, this is a world of surfaces, of decorated surfaces. Okay? Well, then notice she speaks, the woman in the room speaks. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Presumably she's speaking to somebody here. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you're thinking. Think. I think we are in Rat's Alley where the dead men lost their bones. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing. Again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? Oh, 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 that Shakespearean rag. It is so elegant, so intelligent. Now, I'm not a very good singer, but if I were a good singer, this is supposed to be an imitation of ragtime music, which was very popular right after World War I, in the 1920s. Ragtime music, which came from over here in America, of course, but it also became very popular over in Europe as well. And notice, ragtime was called rag, right? so that there were songs that would be called the this rag and the that rag, like the downtown rag or the uptown rag and so forth, because rag was a term used for that kind of song. Now here, of course, what he's talking about is everything becomes so trivial as that Shakespearean rag. Shakespeare even has declined to becoming something trivial in modern popular culture. And she goes on, what shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down. So, what shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? The hot water at 10, and if it rains, a closed car at 4. This would be a limousine, by the way. And we shall play a game of chess, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door. She's forever waiting for something to happen. Okay? So this is another image of a kind of death in the modern world. Here's this woman surrounded by the very best of material goods that the culture can offer. And she's bored, neurotic, waiting for something to happen. Well, then we get to the working class woman. When Will's husband, remember I said Will was the one that the women were going to be talking about, got demobbed. Demobbed is an English expression for people being demobilized out of the army or some military service. And of course, this was composed right after World War I. So when Will's husband got demobbed, in other words, discharged from the military, I said, I didn't mince my words. I said to her myself, hurry up, please, it's time. Now, what we're going to hear throughout here is, hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. They're in a bar. And it's British law that there's a curfew. You can only drink up to a certain point. And the bar man or bar woman is obliged to announce this when it's coming up. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back. Make yourself a bit smart. That is to say, make yourself up. A bit smart in the old sense of not smart intelligent, but smart as in pretty looking. He'll want to know what you've done with that money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. Okay, that's what Albert is going to want to know. What'd you do with that money I gave you to get yourself some new teeth? He did. I was there. You have them all out, Will, and get a nice set. Okay? Get a nice set of teeth. You know how false teeth are perfect, right? He said, I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can it I said. And think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years. He wants a good time. And if you don't give it to him, there's others will, I said. Okay, this is her advice. This is one woman's advice to the other. Oh, is there, she said. Something of that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique, and her only 31. You see, she's already old for her years because of the life that she's had to live. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same. Okay, the chemist is a druggist. That's, in England, drugstores are called chemist shops. And what she's done is she's had an abortion. Okay? You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, we all know what that means, right? There it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? Okay, so here's this nosy, bossy, friend here. Hurry up, please, it's time. Well, that Sunday, Albert was home. They had a hot gammon, and they asked me in to dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night. Ta-ta. Good night, good night. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night, good night. And that's the end of that section, as they now are escorted, as it were, out of the pub. And then we have the fire sermon, and let's look at least at part of that. Notice what's happened to the river. Let's go back to the PowerPoint, please. The fire sermon is a very famous sermon that Buddha originally preached, according to a very, very, very long tradition. The Buddha, right? Great spiritual leader of the East. And the Buddha, according to tradition, preached a very famous sermon which has traditionally been called the fire sermon. Okay? Now, what Eliot is doing here is, again, ironic, because under the title, the fire sermon, what we're going to see are more images of disintegration and decay. Certainly not the kind of spiritual richness that we would find from the Buddha, but once again, a kind of emptiness. The River Thames, running through London, was once the site of beauty and romance, and it's now contaminated by debris. People have just thrown their junk and their garbage into the river. And we have the typist and the young man carbuncular, which is a terrible expression, isn't it? You know what a carbuncle is? Well, it's more than just it's a multi-celled boil. A multi-celled boil. This is the young man carbuncular, who's having this casual, totally meaningless sex with the young typist. Okay? Meaningless to both of them, by the way. And that is contrasted with the world of romance, such as the world of Queen Elizabeth and her lover Leicester. Okay? Let's see. Okay, we're not to death by water yet. Okay, so let's look first of all, the river, the images of the river. The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. See, it's no longer a place of wonder. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed. And their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors, departed, have left no addresses. By the waters of Aman I sat down and wept. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. Sweet Thames, run softly, for I speak not loud or long. But at my back, in a cold blast, I hear the rattle of the bones and chuckles spread from ear to ear. A rat crept softly through the vegetation, dragging its slimy belly on the bank while I was fishing in the dull canal on a winter evening round behind the gas house, musing upon the king my brother's wreck and on the king my father's death before him, white bodies naked on the low damp ground and bones cast in a little low dry garret, rattled by the rat's foot only, year to year. But at my back from time to time I hear the sound of horns and motors, which shall bring Sweeney to Mrs. Porter in the spring, and so forth. Well, then we have the repetition in 207 of what we had earlier on, Unreal City. Under the brown fog. Brown fog because of what? Why is the fog brown? Because of the industrial pollution. I mean, this is a world that we have destroyed in the modern world. Under the brown fog of a winter noon, Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, and so on and so on. Okay, the violet hour when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits like a taxi, throbbing, waiting. I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, can see at the violet hour the evening hour that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from the sea. Tiresias, often literary critics think of this as a central point in the poem. Tiresias is now an old man. When he was a younger man, according to ancient mythology, he was out in the woods one day and he came across two snakes, copulating. And at the sight, as a result of seeing this, he was transformed from a man into a woman, magically. And he lived as a woman for some years. And then he's out in the woods another time, and he comes across two snakes copulating. And he is transformed back into a man. Well, then, a little bit later on, there is a debate going on Mount Olympus between the gods and goddesses over who enjoys sex more, man or woman. Well, how do you resolve something like that? How could you possibly resolve something like that? Well, they go to Tiresias, because Tiresias is the only human who has been both man and woman. And of course, Tiresias gives the obvious answer: women enjoy sex more than men do. So, I see a few skeptical looks. So, here, but well, anyway, this is what Tiresias said, and of course he settled the dispute. Okay, so what else is he seeing? The typist home at tea time. This is a young woman who is a typist in an office. Clears her breakfast, lights her stove, lays out food in tins, out of the window perilously spread her drying combinations touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan are piled at night or bed, that's where she sleeps. Divan is a kind of sofa. Stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dugs, perceived the scene and foretold the rest. I, too, awaited the expected guest. He, the young man carbuncular, arrives, a small house agent's clerk. So he's just another guy, another working guy. With one bold stare, one of the low, on whom assurance sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. He thinks a whole lot of himself. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. The meal is ended, she is bored and tired, endeavors to engage her in caresses, which still are unreproved, if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response, which is a wonderful touch here, and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have forsuffered all, enacted on the same divan or bed, I who have sat by Thebes below the wall, and walked amongst the lowest of the dead. And what does he do, the young man carbuncular, after he has had sexual relations with the typist? Bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. What does she do? She turns and looks a moment in the glass, this is the mirror, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. A record player, the old-fashioned record players. Okay? So that's all there is. See, it's just this, not just casual sex, but it's totally meaningless. It's meaningless to him. It's meaningless to her. And over against that we have, a little farther along, Elizabeth and Leicester. Beating oars, the stern was formed a gilded shell, red and gold. The brisk swell rippled both shores. Southwest wind carried downstream. The peal of bells, white towers, and so forth. This is the world of the past, the world of romance, the world of elegance. But what do we have here? Trams. Trams are trucks. It's an English word for trucks. Dusty trees, and so forth. Okay? Dusty trees in the sense that all of the pollution is settled on the leaves of the trees. Well, well. Then notice how that section ends. To Carthage, then I came. This is St. Augustine in his Confessions. Burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest burning. And notice that even the syntax is falling apart here, isn't it? We don't even have a complete sentence, really, because everything has fallen apart. Everything has fallen into incoherence. What's the reference to St. Augustine about? Augustine says in his Confessions, which is a great autobiographical work, perhaps the greatest early autobiographical work, what he does is he talks about going to what in his time and in his place in North Africa was the big city, Carthage. And in the city is where he encountered the burning, 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 burning of all of his passions. And he tells us that as a young man, he engaged in gambling, he went to the Colosseum, to the horrible kinds of games that were carried on in the Colosseum. He ran after women. He lived with a woman for a number of years, by the way, without benefit of marriage, and had an illegitimate child by her. And then he later on, as a young adult, converted to Christianity and underwent this total life change. So notice what Eliot is doing with that. You see, here, at least, even though in his Confessions, Augustine is saying, my God, I never should have done these things, and I thank God that God was always there to pluck me out, to save me from what otherwise would have been my eternal damnation. But at the very least, what we find in Augustine, whatever his attitude towards his earlier life may have been, some genuine kind of passion. Okay? And that's what's absent in the modern world. That's the point of these contrasts. The typist, the young woman typist, and the young man carbuncular, with their meaningless, passionless sex, contrasted with Elizabeth and Leicester, and with the young Augustine. And then we have death by water. Remember that Madame Sostres had said, fear death by water? Phlebas the Phoenician. Let's go back to the PowerPoint for a minute. Phlebas the Phoenician, now dead, drifts passively with the motions of the water. Right? You can imagine a dead body in the water, just drifting and just sort of moving one way or moving another way, this way and that, following the currents of the water, because the person is now dead. Well, this too becomes an image of the modern world, in which we are simply carried this way and that, this way and that, but without any real purpose, without any real action or determination on our part. Again, from Eliot's point of view. So Phlebas the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell and the profit and loss. A current under sea picked his bones in whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you. Well, okay. And then we come to the final section, what the thunder said. What the thunder said. And here we have a nightmarish landscape. God is dead. As the German philosopher Nietzsche had said, God is dead, and we have killed him. And what, well, I'm not going to presume to know everything that Nietzsche was up to, but what people have taken Nietzsche's statement to mean often enough is that we have become soulless, we have lost our faith, we have lost our moral compass, we have lost our belief in any kind of transcendent reality, and therefore it is not God who has died, it is we who in effect have killed off God. And we are going to see after the agony and death of Christ, Christ does return, but is unrecognized. And there's actually a passage in the Bible dealing with that. After Christ's resurrection, him walking with those who do not recognize him. So the civilized world here no longer has a center. Reality and unreality are going to become confused as they slide one into another. as they have been throughout the poem. I mean, that's one of the things that we've seen is really the incoherence often of the poem is expressive of the incoherence of our lives and our world. And this nightmare is going to drift into the image of the Chapel Perilous out of medieval romance, the object of the Grail quest of the knights from Arthur's court. We are going to see flashes of lightning, a cock crowing, which can mean various things, either from the beginning of the coming of the new day to the betrayal by St. Peter of Christ in the biblical story. But perhaps a promise of rain, even though it's not raining yet. And then we're going to see the conclusion. And you'll see that in your textbook. You don't have to write that down. At the very, very end. Okay, so let's look at what the thunder said. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation, O thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. Okay? Notice that all of these images here are images of the passion and death of Christ, right? After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, the frosty silence in the garden. This is Christ in the garden, right? Torchlights held up to his face by those who are arresting him, going to carry him off. After the agony in stony places, the shouting, the crying, prison, palace, reverberations of thunder, etc., he who was living is now dead. We who are living are now dying with a little patience. Here is no water, but only rock. Rock and no water and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink amongst the rock. One cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock. Dead mountain, mouth of carious teeth that cannot spit. Here one can neither stand nor lie nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry, sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. It's in a desert. And if you haven't been there, perhaps you've seen pictures of what it's like in the desert. You know, not only the endless or seemingly endless sand, but many deserts actually have mountains in them. You know, like the desert areas of Syria, parts of Egypt and so forth. There are mountains too. Dry rock. If there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water and water a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, drip, drop, 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 drop. But there is no water. This is very unusual poetry, isn't it? Okay, this is part of what I've been talking about in connection with modernism. Think also about paintings. You know, I know some people were talking about paintings that they had seen at various exhibits when I first came in tonight, and they were talking about modernist paintings in particular. And look at the way in which certain modernist painters have also rearranged that which we perceive to be real in creating something which does not exist in our world except in the world of imagination as expressed in the world of art, right? And a couple of people were talking about Salvador Dali. And Dali is a perfect example of this. Okay, so here we have that being acted out in poetry. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together, but when I look up ahead, up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding, wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is it? But who is that on the other side of you? This, of course, is the Christ who does live after all, but is unrecognized, is as if he were not there. A presence, but in a sense not a presence to these people. What is that sound high in the air, murmur of maternal lamentation? Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is the city over the mountains, cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air, falling towers? Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. Taking us back to that leitmotif we had earlier. Not only the great cities of ancient times, but the great cities of modern times as well. So, let's skip down to 386. In this decayed hole among the mountains, in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing over the tumbled graves about the chapel. There is the empty chapel, only the wind's home. It has no windows, and the door swings, dry bones can harm no one. Only a cock stood on the roof tree. Cocorico, cocorico, in a flash of lightning, then a damp gust bringing rain. In one of his notes, Eliot said that the chapel that he was referring to was the Chapel Perilous that I mentioned earlier from the Grail legends, the Grail romances of the Middle Ages, filled with all of their idealism and passion. And here, notice, the chapel is empty. Okay? Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over the Himavant. The jungle crouched, humped in silence, then spoke the thunder. Da, da. What have we given, my friends, blood shaking my heart? The awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries or in memories draped by the beneficent spider or under seals broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. Da, Dayadvam. I have heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison, thinking of the key, each confirms a prison only at nightfall. Ethereal rumors revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus. Da, Damyata. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? London Bridge is falling down, and so forth. You know, the poi saccosa nel foco che gli affina, quando fiam uti ciledon, O swallow, swallow, la prince d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why, then, I'll fit you. Hieronymo's mad again. Data, Dayadvam, Damyata. Shanti, 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 which according to Eliot means the peace which passeth understanding. The peace which passeth understanding. But we're still in the wasteland. There may be the hope of a way out. There may be a hope for water from purifying, life-giving rain. But only if we can recover, Eliot believes, our spiritual selves and our spiritual centeredness in the great religious traditions, both East and West. So let's take our break and we'll come back in a moment.